This is a conversation about what's happening currently in Ukraine, geopolitically. Maybe we're going to discuss militaristically what is happening. I am Andreas Panagis, studying economics in Maastricht, and I'm also really into warfare, history, and geopolitics. And with me, I have Lucas Pinkers. Lucas?
Oh, hey, yes, I'm Lucas, and I just generally have some interest in some geopolitics and stuff, but not as much. I'm really just going to be asking questions to Andreas to like more or less inform me about the situation.
Yep. Okay. Let's get into it. So, Lucas, your questions about Ukraine.
Yeah. So one thing that I've been like hearing sort of quite different opinions about, I'm curious to hear what's yours, is sort of the reason that Russia is doing this attack. And also to extend on that, like how successful it is versus like what Putin expected. Like, I think, for example, like the sanctions. I think so far what I've heard, like everyone's kind of in agreement that those were like unexpectedly harsh. That probably Russia didn't expect them. But like on the military side, for example, I hear quite conflicting things where some people say like it's a big failure. Like Russia had expected to take Ukraine like 2 days. They didn't expect it to take like weeks. But then there's others who said like, no, this is probably what they expected. Like, yes, they tried to quickly maybe like take Kiev in like a super blitzkrieg in like 2 days, but as sort of as a hail mary, they didn't like expect it to like really work, and like it's still going to according to their plan. Um,
Let's
yeah.
start with the first thing. I'm going to try to be as fast as I can because it's a very big subject that I can easily talk for it for more than an hour. So geopolitically, let's first of all we condemn the invasion of Ukraine. It's unethical. Me as a Cypriot who have suffered immensely from a Turkish invasion, and whatever the reasons, the geopolitical reasons that may give an excuse for Russia to invade, does not give them the moral argument to do so. So that's very important to keep in mind. Now, whatever moral argument we are discussing just doesn't really matter that much in the end of the day because the reason this is happening is not about morality. The reason this is happening is about geopolitics. It's about Russia securing its borders. So the main thing is that Russia fears NATO because it sees NATO as an
Mm-hmm.
offensive alliance. Okay, NATO countries may consider themselves as defensive alliances, but this is practically just not the case because it doesn't matter what you consider yourself. What it matters is how the countries surrounding you consider you to be. And the case is that the rest of the world that's not part of NATO considers NATO as an offensive alliance. We can see that in Kosovo, the bombardment of Belgrade, the intervention in Libya, uh, NATO countries intervening in Iraq. They even partially intervened in the Congo Wars, and the general aggression of the major Western countries the past 50 years. So seeing those countries and NATO itself as being an aggressive alliance is a reasonable request that Russia is claiming. So Ukraine being part of NATO means the heartland of Russia itself becomes heavily exposed. So it's only natural for Russia to want to protect itself. Now that is one of the main reasons. I can go deeper into this, but the main thing Russia fears Ukraine being part of NATO. Of course, Russia has a general attitude towards wanting to have buffer states. The idea is that the heartland of Russia is in its west and its economics areas, so it likes to have some buffer states between itself and possible enemies, which is NATO. And those buffer states up to this moment were Belarus and Ukraine. If you go to the south, you have multiple states like Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, or to the east, Kazakhstan, the whole stance, Mongolia, and so forth. Russia always surrounded itself with buffer states or with countries that are by definition neutral towards you. And Ukraine wants to get away from it. Morally, they have the right to do so, but we're talking about geopolitics now. That's why this is happening. They feel threatened. So Russia, to secure itself, it will either aim to create a new Ukrainian buffer state or at least manage to create a defensive line to a possible Ukrainian entry into NATO. And that would be the Dnieper River. Why the Dnieper? Well, it's an amazing defensive line, so it matters militaristically. and most importantly, it shortens its lines of defense. It creates a huge buffer for any future possible thing that will ever happen. Because when you discuss about geopolitics, that is what matters. Now, this is the main argument they have about why they don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO. But the war didn't happen just because of this. Because if that was the case, they would have invaded the whole of Ukraine years ago. We have to see why it actually happened now. And in my opinion, there are like two reasons, or three maybe. One is the mass media giving attraction to what is happening in Ukraine and a small arms race, so Ukraine being equipped. But in my opinion, most importantly, is Putin's claims of wanting to sending troops to Ukraine, like 5,000 troops in mid-January. Now, if you are Russia and you hear this claim, and we're only thinking about this militaristically, what do you think? If American troops land on Ukraine, I cannot attack, right? It's literally impossible to attack. I
Mm,
cannot run
yeah.
America.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
moment that Biden makes that claim, and then there are no American troops at the moment, but he makes the claim that he may send American troops, it's like giving a deadline to Russia itself. You have to attack up to this time limit. Now the thing gets
Mm,
worse if we understand the geography of Russia and Ukraine. Now in Russia you have a special weather called Rasputitsa. Rasputitsa is the period between the start of March until the start of the summer and spring, between October till December, late November, where everything is mud. And while modern infrastructure is better to be able to use normal roads, in war you cannot just use roads. You have to go off road. Like that's the main thing. Because if you use roads, then you can't really attack. So that means that Russia had a very small deadline. Biden made the claims by the end of January, and it has barely a month to do something. Now the tensions rose. I'm not going to get over to it, just to make it as quick as possible. And then we have one more reason why this happens. And this has to do with the culture of Russia, something that the West has totally ignored. You can't really judge Russia and the behavior of the Russian politicians and the Russian peoples based on Western standards. You have to judge them based on Russian standards. What is to be Russian? And one of them, these very important standards, it's the concept of the Voj. What is the Voj? Now, the Voj is a Russian saying. It's the Iron Man. It's the strong leadership, a strong leader that chooses everything. And the people, the Russian people, always wanted a Voj. Now, historically, we can see that due to the from the Tsars, the concept of serfdom they had, and it goes deep. You can read Orlando Fige's three different books about the Russian history, making various claims about the uniqueness of Russian culture. But the main idea is that the Russians have the concept of the Voj. The leader must be strong. Also, Russians are nationalistic as a people. Now, the more of Ukraine got, the whole thing got publicized more and more and more, the more Russian people hear about they losing and they fearing NATO being in their border. And they rely on Putin. Putin brought stability. Putin brought a sort of a feeling of greatness back from to the Russian people. And suddenly, Putin is in a crossroads. He's like, okay, if I back down, the backlash that I'm going to get from my people, they will remove me of power. And this is not an absurd claim. We have seen that, for example, from Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He backed down, they took them out of power. And Cuba wasn't as close to Russia as Ukraine is. We see that from Gorbachev,
mm,
that he tried to dissolve the Soviet Union in a peaceful manner, and they threw him down, despite the fact that what he did was amazingly in securing so many people not to die. So what Putin was in a very hard position. As you can see from media, Putin in the past 20 years always portrayed himself as this all-knowing, super powerful figure. Riding bears, riding horses, jumping in the cold water. All of this is to create an idea behind the name of Putin, the Voj. It's exactly what Stalin did. That's not new in Russia. If you want to be a leader in Russia, you have to be a Voj. Now, the US, by pressing Russia publicly, put in a very difficult position. Even if he wanted to back down, which we don't really know, but if he wanted, everything being public, put him in a very hard position to just back down. Now, again, what I'm saying doesn't justify the invasion, but we're making a critical analysis of why it actually happens, because that is what matters in the end of the day.
Yeah,
Before,
that's
before moving forward, it's important also to understand that, in my opinion, this could be averted if everything was done behind closed doors. It would be easier for Putin and probably for the West to just give them some concessions. And before moving on to the warfare and everything, to the rest of your question, there's one small point I want to argue. I am a firm believer in the concept of Europe. The idea introduced in the Treaty of Vienna in 1814. The idea that to have eternal peace or something that resembles peace, you have to have a balance of power. That means no one is above the other. Everyone should, at least at some extent, feel secure when it comes to its geopolitical demands. That implies that Ukraine doesn't necessarily have to be a puppet state, but at the same time, it doesn't mean it can do whatever it wants. A great example could be Finland. Finland has always been in a bad position against Russia. They fought the Winter War in 1939. After World War II, where Finland could be in the mercy of USSR, and it could easily join NATO, it chose a different path. It chose the path of neutrality. Finland will choose to arm its own self, but it will not allow anything to NATO. NATO could not fly over Finland, it could not send weapons to Finland, nothing. That gave the feeling to the Russians of being very secure. As a result, the tensions between those countries haven't increased at all. It's a concept of understanding a balance of power, something we completely failed to apply here in Ukraine. Now, ask me again your other questions.
um yeah.
I'm,
No,
I'm
so
sorry.
yeah, it's sort of like how you see the war is going. Like, there's a lot of propaganda now, I would say, right? And people get sort of very nationalistic, or like for the West, so it's very hard to, you're gonna hear all these claims, that, Ukraine is kind of like winning because they're stalling, and Russia had expected to win in like 2 days, and it's taking them a lot longer. And you see
Okay,
like all these,
okay,
the
that's
memes about like the long columns that are like stuck. So I just want to hear your opinion of, like, do you think, like,
warfare wise.
ignoring the sanctions, like on the military point, like, do you
Yeah,
think
yeah.
there is like kind of according to plan, or are they like in trouble,
Yes,
sort of?
yes, it is going to plan up to an extent. There is the say that once war begins, all of the plans collapse. But of course, I'm kind of against that claim to begin with. But yeah, so the idea is, could they have won in a 2 days war? In theory, if the willingness for the Ukrainian people to fight was lower, yes, that was a possibility. And Russia, up to an extent, expected that, or at least hoped for that possibility. But
Mm.
that doesn't imply that their military plan is not working. No war, nor actual total war, has ended in like 2 3 days, like except some extreme cases. Even one of the
Yeah, so
best.
it's more like yeah, it's like a
Yeah,
probability, right? Like they there's like a chance that they might, and they hope for this, that they might win super quick, and like Zelensky would just like probably like
surrender.
flee, and the
Yeah,
government would just immediately collapse, and morale would collapse. But yeah, they definitely, I guess, also took into account that this might not happen, right? And
exactly,
then yeah,
exactly. And what is actually happening is that if you see the 6 days war of Israel, it's one of the best examples of blitzkrieg, of lighting war, defeating all of your enemies in a small amount of time. They won in 6 days, in like 1/100th of the size. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 took 40 days. And we're talking about a way bigger American army. Way bigger
yeah,
American army. The invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939 took more than 3 weeks. The invasion of France in 1940, which was one of the beautiful blitzkrieg, took 6 weeks. Yes, the major encirclement did occur in the first 7 days, but the whole end of the conflict, it took 6 weeks. Warfare is costly and it takes time. and Ukraine is massive. So yeah,
Yeah.
to analyze that better, let me show you something. It's all about understanding warfare and the placement of troops. Now, let's start from the side of Ukraine. I am Ukraine. I don't have a massive army. In theory, I cannot
Hmm.
compete in open field with the Russian army, but I have the advantage of the defense. The defense always has the advantage. I also have the advantage of being easily supplied by the West, being in the center of the West, or at least very close to the West. Now, Ukraine, if we forgot about nationalism and think purely about war, because that's the most important thing about war. You, your main priority is to do as much damage to the enemy as possible. Now, Ukraine has one of the best defensible positions in the world, and that's the Dnieper River. Whatever modern army exists, if I control the Dnieper, I fear nothing. To be breached, it must be really, really hard. So an initial plan will be a small amount of forces on the north, mainly because the northern area is filled with marshes. You can ask the Nazis how they attack through this area. It's really hard to maneuver in the northern part of Ukraine here. So
Mm.
having few forces here can easily be defended. And at the same time, you can have some uh, tactical positions in front of your lines to not to risk. Uh, here, maybe few here, few in the major cities as an idea to slow down the advance, cause as many casualties as you can, and start deploying troops on the Dnieper. At the same time, start creating some strategic reserves. Strategic reserves implies having troops not in place on the front line, but placed behind the front line to respond to any possible threats from paratroopers or any specific attacks on a point on the line. That would be the ultimate plan. And the Russians know that, right? The Russians are aware of
Hmm.
this possible plan. So the Russians, their main military priority, as is in any blitzkrieg, is not to capture territory. That's why we shouldn't look them up and see how much territory Russia captured today. It's about how many casualties can I cause the enemy. And circlements are one of the main ways to do it. Now, Russia could have chosen multiple ways to attack, like the three-battle system of Tukhachevsky, like focus all of their armies at one point and just roller coaster through Ukraine, like focus all of their armies here, just push through and whatever happens, or at 2 points. But they haven't chosen to do that, which in my opinion would have been a more traditional Russian approach. They've chosen Blitzkrieg. Their priorities are the so the beginning of the invasion was more like this. So the like this. So the priorities are to capture a bridgehead on the Dnieper. That's the main priority. So if they in the
Hmm.
first attack of the offensive they capture a bridgehead, that means it nullifies a huge portion of the Ukrainian defenses. The second priority is encircle Ukrainian troops that were here due to the previous conflict. And their third objective was a political objective in Kiev. Of course, whatever I'm saying are assumptions. I cannot obviously know. We have to see what
Yeah.
history says, but that's what we expect. Why
But
Kiev?
did they capture the bridgehead?
Yes, yes. We're gonna
Okay.
go. We're gonna go over what they did. So Kiev. Why is it political? Because every modern military man will argue that attacking a city is almost suicide. To you either with the moment you attack a city, you come in you come in face with the city, you will try to do an assault on the city to use the panic and the shock that exists to capture the city, and if you fail, you just do a siege because fighting a city war, it's deadly, and the Russians know that. The Russians lost thousands of men in Grozny in the Chechen wars. They lost hundreds of thousands in Afghanistan in city war. You cannot fight in a city. That's why it's a political. Militaristical doesn't
Mm.
make much of a sense. Now, let's see what they actually did up to now. Of course, we can't really know the exact locations of the troops, but again, these are the assumptions. Now, the Ukrainian army didn't go with the plan I just proposed. They chose something, in my opinion, peculiar. They chose to keep this line, and it's heavily reinforced with jobs. They chose to protect some important parts in Kharkiv. They had some concentration troops here, few here, and few here. and they didn't really have much of strategic reserves. At the same time, the Russian blitzkrieg chose to do a combination of blitzkrieg and aerial attacks on various cities. That was, I think, for them to force Ukraine to surrender immediately, but it backfired. They lost a ton of shit of paratroopers. So they landed paratroopers here, in various areas here, here. Now, I don't know specifically the areas they landed paratroopers, but they landed a lot, and a huge
Mm-hmm.
portion of them just died. That was in very high risk. And also, a note here, I'm not going to get into it, there are amazing YouTube videos about it. The Russian Air Force right now is failing on its objectives. It's very important to notice. The Russian Air Force is failing. It's not doing what's expected. It still has air dominance, but it's not as efficient as it should have been. It's important to note that. Now, let's start with the initial front line, which was like this. Now, in the initial stages, they managed to breach the line here and capture Kherson, or at least in the initial stages surround Kherson. So they managed to get the first bridgehead. Then they moved over here, capturing this area and surrounding Mariupol, and they breach through here and circling Kharkiv, creating a line over here, and they gradually push through these directions, but kind of slowly, not with so many troops. Right here, and then the front line right now looks more like this, I guess. It's really hard to know exactly, but kind of on these lines. And most importantly, they breach this area here. Now, this area is very important. The Ukrainian army has really failed to stop them here, and they could have stopped them easily due to the marches that I mentioned later. Now, in these few days, they made some more offensives here, here, here. These are more like dotted lines. We're not really sure of what is happening. It's not exactly sure yet. And here. I'm not sure if they got Mykolaiv, but I know they have extended their line kind of here. So now they have managed to secure their southern line. Now in Kiev, they have encircled the city, they started the siege warfare, they tried to completely cut it off. That is purely political, it's a means to force the Ukrainian government to surrender. But the main operation is in the south. So their idea now is to cut off this army and completely destroy it and exploit their offensive here. Now, in purely militaristic terms, Ukraine is in a bad position because it hasn't managed to stop the southern offensive, but the fight is still not lost. Why is it still not lost? They still hold a portion of the Dnieper, and they can easily create some reserve lines. In the worst possible case scenario, Ukraine can just still do this. The population living on Western Ukraine is extremely anti-Russian, and as a result, with a continuous supply of the West, if they have the willingness to fight, they can hold them off. Rasputitsa has already begun, or at least the snows are going away. Mud is coming in. The Russian offensive is slowing down day by day, which is expected. I mean, their troops are getting tired and so forth. Now, in the first 7 days, Russia hasn't used any of its strategic reserves, or at least we think it hasn't, and it used them in the couple of 2-3 days to expand their bridgehead in the south, here and here. Their probable aims is now is either expand their attack here, which in my opinion will overextend their troops, or completely enclose the areas here as a result, encircling that army and being able to regroup. Capturing this much land in 10 days is not a failure. You cannot consider this as a failure. No army is an amazing army. War is hard, and capturing territory, if you have resistance, is really, really hard. This is an open total war. Ukraine is not surrendering. They are giving up a strong fight. And the fact that they have lost quite a lot of land shows that the Russians are still gaining. Now, if we're expecting that the majority of the Ukrainian army has been committed to the fight, then a possible collapse of multiple front lines, such as the one that was collapsed here and here, might bring the end of the Ukrainian defense altogether. If the Ukrainian army has employed the majority of its defenses, of its forces. And a
Mm.
circumvent on this line will mean an Inzil and circumvent just bombard the shit out of them and just move the majority of your mobile and armored divisions forward to the attack. Since you have captured the bridgehead, it puts the Ukrainian army in a really, really hard position. Now, the Russian invasion is not going bad, but it's not going perfectly. The Russian Air Force hasn't been really successful. There are a lot of instances that in the first 2 days they caused massive casualties on the Ukrainian air defense systems and air force, but for some reason they didn't follow through to eliminate the Ukrainian air force and air defense systems altogether. And second of all, the Ukrainian air force was able to launch strikes on Russian troops. That implies the Russian air control is not total, which is kind of a disgrace. And lastly, a lot of portion of the Russian planes that are used in this operation are not their most modern planes, which raises quite a lot of eyebrows. Like, why aren't you committing your major forces? Also, Russia has
Mm.
barely committed 15% of its army. So, in the very long run, yes, they could commit a way bigger army for this operation. We are still seeing the end of the initial stages of the invasion. That's why the everyday gains become lower and lower. We can say that the operation will fail when the Russian invasion completely stalls. So when a couple of days passes and now Russia gains nothing. At this point, Russia is already sieging a couple of major cities like Kiev, Mariupol, Kharkiv, I think, was lost, and Kherson was lost. I think they are encircled this as well. That means they have quite a lot of troops on these areas and they're sieging them. Now, a note here about the convoy. That's not a surprise. I mean, to move a strategic reserve into the front, we're talking about moving like 10,000 troops. It takes time to move those troops. Nothing happens really fast. The road system is heavily damaged, so it's obviously to see congestions. Repositioning troops is hard, so it's not a problem that this happens. It's a natural part
Um,
of war.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No, that paints a lot more nuanced picture than hearing all the Western propaganda that Ukraine or like Russia's invasion is totally failing. Blah blah blah. Okay, so then
Yes.
yeah, like what are different sort of paths that this gets resolved? Like, I guess the West is just going to throw Ukraine under the bus or something. But like, how do you think this is going to look like, sort of?
So it's really hard to predict. It's not like the West is throwing Ukraine out of the bus. It's not like that at all. What can
So they haven't, but they might have to, right?
they will.
Um,
They will, because for me, the West played a gamble, a very strong gamble regarding this whole thing. The gamble that the Russians will not be actually willing to invade Ukraine, and they could force Ukraine to be part of NATO. Not force it, put Ukraine under NATO, and they can do whatever they want. And the whole plan backfired. And I guess at this point they have to punish Russia, obviously, to punish their illegal invasion. And it's most important to see it from the side of Putin. Now, I really enjoy Russian history and the Russian people in general, but even if I was a Russian and if I was a Russian nationalist, which I'm not, just to clarify that, I will still oppose this invasion. I will still say that this invasion gives more consequences to Russia than benefits. Why? Russia is losing a lot in the short term. Like, it loses massively in the short term. It's like the Putin right now went to the public and told them that I'm gonna destroy any potential prosperity that you might have for the next 10 years. The next 10 years
yeah,
that Putin is gonna be on power. And who's gonna replace Putin later? After a destroyed economy of Russia. At what cost will they achieve their victory? On the other hand, I think Putin is watching this whole thing in a more historical perspective. In his opinion, he's securing the geopolitical position of future Russia. of Russia in 40 years. And at that regard, Russia is going to win whatever they embargo. The opinion, in the very long run, if the Cold War doesn't escalate, that it will be a sort of renormalization, at least in 10 years, like it happened after Crimea. Of course, the world might actually go towards another Cold War. And the West is actually getting hyped for this potential Cold War. RT being banned in various media, Russian banning Western media, banned from US Air Force, from flying over the countries, Dutch universities discontinuing communications with Russian universities. This whole thing, we are driven
Yeah.
into, in my opinion, a madness of the Cold War. We don't really appreciate the peace that we got after the end of the Cold War, and we are rushing into this new Cold War without, in my opinion, trying to reason how to fix this whole fucking problem. Now, I'm not saying we have to give in to Russian invasion. Russia has chosen the wrong move. But at the same time, we should find another solution to this. Going to a full-blown Cold War will probably only result to China taking Taiwan. The best possible scenario. China be like, fuck it, I'm going to take Taiwan. What are you going to do about it? You can't put the same embargo on me. And the economic disaster on the West, it's massive. It's also going to be massive. For example, as a Cypriot, 35% of our foreign direct investment comes from Russia. Yeah, we support Ukraine on this. Obviously we do. And we feel their pain. This is an illegal invasion, but at what cost? We're seeing about the destruction of the Cypriot economy if we apply the full measures of the embargo because we are part of the European Union. At
Yeah.
what cost are we going to do this?
I mean, yeah, I just also, I mean, that's probably like also a big difference, right, between um, Russian culture and like Western culture and democracies. Like, we aren't willing to take that much like sacrifice for a long time. Um, and this is also why it seems in a way a bit like a bluff that we're doing with like all these sanctions. Like I don't really see a way that Russia can't really get its way and, you know, whatever, and kind of we just in whatever form sort of just throw Ukraine out on the bus because we are so reliant. I mean, like the biggest thing is like energy, right? Like energy prices were already incredibly high, especially in Europe, because of partially, I would say, failure of governments that push too hard for green agenda without thinking of like, oh, you know, maybe there is like a month that the wind doesn't blow as much in all of Europe, and then shit. So then we had like an increasing reliance on natural gas. Natural gas cannot be transported easily. You know, you basically only have pipelines, or you can use it with like LNG tankers, but those are very expensive, plus require like years, like build the terminals to transport them. So like even before the invasion, like European energy prices were sky high. Like European natural gas was trading at like something like 5 times the price it cost in the US, and that's before the invasion, right? And currently, you know, Russian gas is still flowing, right? Like the sanctions, you know, we like it's the sanctions are all sort of, you know, the sanctions don't apply for energy, right? So like any energy trade can still happen with Russia, but that's, you know, it's kind of mutual destruction because like Russia definitely needs the dollars it gets from the energy sales because it already is cut off from like any other sources, right? Because of the sanctions, so it definitely needs this. Um, but the West, like especially Germany and some other countries that, you know, heavily are reliant on Russian gas, just they like if we don't get that gas, then we will just like, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be like there will be no power, etc. Right? So like we also need the gas. So like I don't know. So maybe Russia just might eventually just be like, fuck it, like, you know, we will just, you know, not sell you the gas anymore. And
It's, I am of the opinion America is the only one that's going to gain after this. They are the only ones that are not going to get heavily impacted by the sanctions, and Europe is going to get in massive damage. And you are right on this. But I do like the approach we have taken with the sanctions up to a degree, because we shouldn't dehumanize the Russian people as a people. And the sanctions have focused on the oligarchs of Russia. And Russia is, up to a greater extent, ruled by those oligarchs. Of course, that doesn't imply that the Russian people aren't going to get affected. They are going to get affected. Their economy is going to get destroyed. But those oligarchs themselves are also going to receive a massive damage. And those oligarchs do influence the decision making of Russia itself. So yes, those sanctions in the long term will affect heavily on the decisions of Russia to withdraw. It's not completely an appeasement. I wouldn't say the Western policy is a policy of appeasement. The Western economies rule the world economy, and Russia is suffering heavily out of this. And even after they succeed the invasion, even if they manage to apply, they put a puppet state. If those sanctions continue and the West still receives a massive damage, the economic damage of Russia will also be unprecedented. It will be massive. As a result, those sanctions might actually work. And they will work even better if Ukraine doesn't surrender. So if they manage to hold this, let's say, drawback line. So in a possible scenario could be Russia annexing everything east of the Dnieper River and letting the rest of Ukraine be independent. This is not such an absurd claim, mainly because the
Mm-hmm.
peoples living in eastern Ukraine are Russophiles, or at least consider themselves pro-Russian, in comparison to Western Ukraine, which are extremely anti-Russian. For example, Crimea or the Donbas region or Moldova Oblast, all of these areas have quite a strong Russian majority, or at least a huge portion of the Russian population. We can even see that with the refugees. I mean, yes, there are 1.2 million refugees, but 130,000 refugees have gone to Russia itself, which is kind of weird, isn't it? No one else is
Yeah.
going to say that. I mean, if you are questioning my source is Al Jazeera, which I'm actually paying quite a lot of attention these days because I believe they are one of the most neutral news reels regarding this invasion.
Mm.
Now, for me, what I fear the most is the radicalization of the West, and because the West has always been the world policeman, the the guardians of morality up to an extent. At least their actions, the people can punish their governments for their actions. And I really love that about the West. I really love that about the West. Because morality plays a role in politics. You can't do really what the fuck you want, even if you're America, which they did, but nonetheless. Uh, but for example, I see the rearmament of Germany. That's fucking scary. No. Germany should have never rearmed. I really don't care if the German people want to be protected. They started two fucking wars. That's enough. Germany shouldn't rearm. We shouldn't go to another arms race. What have we gained from the last arms race? Russia is not
Yeah.
going to attack Russia, even at the current position of NATO, if they don't increase their armament. Russia is not going to attack the West, and if they do, they're going to lose. The economies of the
Yeah.
Western powers are so massive that Russia doesn't possess any actual military force to oppose the West on an European battlefield. Even if they take massive casualties and the willingness to fight of the West is much lower, if the war comes on the territory of the West, the willingness to fight will rise dramatically, and the West will not lose. And we know that. Let's not joke ourselves. We're talking about the top 7 biggest economies in the world, excluding China and Russia, are in Europe and United States. We are not going to lose in an open war to Russia because Russia is never going to attack us in an open war. Russia is not this
Yeah.
grandeur superpower. It's just a strong regional power. It's the 8th biggest economy or something. Yeah, it has a big army, but it can't really replace a huge portion of its equipment losses. It can do a big military invasion of Ukraine, but that's it. It cannot attack the West. So another arms race is not going to solve anything. And Switzerland breaking its neutrality, Finland and Sweden considering joining NATO, The only thing that it will create is completely break the balance of power altogether. It's going to force both sides to go deeper and deeper into a Cold War. And after 20, 30 years of peace, after the last Cold War ended, we saw a massive prosperity, especially here in Europe. We can't understand what we're putting ourselves into. And especially our
Mm,
generation, because we never actually felt the impact of the Cold War. We lived in the best years of peace, at least for Europe, if we accept the Yugoslavian wars.
yeah, yeah, that's very true. I think there's a lot of um, like effects that are happening um, because of this war. Um, I would say, like, yeah, I definitely also heard that this will be um, sort of a big turning point together with COVID on like globalization that we've probably seen peak globalization. And a couple of reasons for this also like more economically where like and this is also what COVID made us realize, but also this is that we realize that oh shit, like global trade is all nice and well when we're all very happy friends, but like it's the opposite if you're adversaries, right? And both the West, but also Russia, and definitely also China will realize, okay, maybe it's not very good that my entire supply chain relies on all these countries, and if there's a war, I will be cut off and I'm unable to manufacture this equipment, etc. myself. The same goes for like the all central banks holding FX reserves in other central banks, right? And now suddenly we just said to Russia, like, okay, your FX reserve don't exist anymore,
But
which
that's
will
the
definitely set a big precedence to like definitely sort of get out of the global system or like get out, yeah, and like try to make currently like all trade goes in dollars, and then try to make have your own payment systems, have like more regional trade networks, and like yeah, make the world a lot less interdependent, which in itself I'd say is quite bad because I think one of the reasons probably that wars are so costly to wage is because the economies are so like intertwined, right? That
exactly.
if you start a war, yeah, but we'll probably start moving away from this, right? And in 2 decades from now, the economic costs of starting another war will probably be a lot less than they are now, and it's easier to start wars again. Yeah.
the the miracle of the European Union of capitalism was because the French and the German economies were so intertwined with the introduction of the European Union that it practically makes war impossible. And one of the main reasons China might not attack Taiwan is exactly that. Our economies are so much intertwined that makes a war, at least a massive war between bigger nations between them, almost impossible. War will always continue because I'm of the opinion it's part of human nature, and regional wars will constantly occur. But massive wars and completely breakup of the financial system between bigger countries, it becomes harder and harder to implement because of the interconnectedness that exists. Now, Russia and the United States don't have that much of interconnectedness, but Russia and the Europe has. What is worrying regarding if we move to the extreme scenario where we start another Cold War and the whole financial system of connectivity collapses, then if China comes to a point to be okay, I'm not going to be able to trade with the West anymore, then I'm going to choose the aggressive option. I'm going to capture what I can to capture. I'm going to capture Taiwan. I'm going to capture Southeast Asia and gain full control of these areas there. If you have nothing to
Mm,
lose, then why not go to war? If you have so much to lose, then you will go to war. And uh, the amazing thing that did happen around the world was exactly that. Now, a huge problem is that this position we are here, it is, going back to my original argument, a breakup of the whole balance of power that existed. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States, let's say, became too strong in the world stage. It could do whatever it wanted. And while it was moving under the umbrella of the world's policeman, it reality didn't feel like that. For example, the one of ministers in the US, it was in Al Jazeera, made the argument that when have we seen before a country recognizing an independent state within another independent country? This is unacceptable in modern history. And then you go 20 years back and you see Kosovo. The US recognized
Mm,
Kosovo. And on top of that, it bombed the shit out of Belgrade. Yeah, you can use a ton of sort of moral arguments, but in the end of the day, they did exactly what Russia did. And if you do things like Kosovo, in the eyes of the Russian people today, they're going to use the same argument I am using at this moment. Well, the US did this with Kosovo. This is double standards. This is not something new. The fact that the US government undermined the Syrian government in 2012, 2014, the fact that they underlined the Iraqi government, the fact that we're in Afghanistan for so long, all of these things makes the West, in the eyes of the rest of the world, as someone that's unreliable, and that the moral arguments that the West is making do not hold. And
mm,
the
yeah.
the the future doesn't seem that much good at the moment. The potential, we haven't recovered from the COVID. We have this thing that will going to cause even bigger shifts in our economies. We might see a potential collapse of the financial system due to the concerns of COVID, and under this, it is quite scary.
Oh yeah. Like on the economic side, like it's quite likely if this doesn't get resolved quickly, this Ukrainian Russian conflict, that would get into quite a severe recession because um, like we already had a lot of inflation because of like a lot of supply chain disruptions because of COVID, right? Like factory shutdowns, blah blah blah. Um, combined with massive like fiscal and monetary stimulus, stimulating demand while supply was heavily disrupted. So we were already like seeing you know very high inflation, um, and now on top of this, um, if this continues and if like the worst thing sort of materializes where the world is kind of cut off from Russian oil, like if that happens, like oil prices are already super high and they're going to remain like incredibly high or even higher for a year plus. The same goes for like wheat. Like Ukraine and Russia produce something like 30% or like a very large part of the exported wheat in the world. I mean, wheat prices have already like I don't know, they're like at record highs already. They might quadruple even more if this lasts longer. So that's especially like energy prices being incredibly high is going to lead to even more inflation than we have. Um, and that's just probably going to mean our central banks will have to hike even more interest rates. But anyway, it doesn't look good, right? It doesn't look good at all. And especially like yeah, like countries like the US. The US is pretty well positioned, relatively speaking, right? Because like for example, like the US. Well, like with yeah, sort of Europe, but also like developing countries, it's very interesting what's going to happen there. If sort of the worser case scenario like materializes where sanctions get maybe even stronger and the war lasts longer, um like countries like in northern Africa, Turkey, Egypt, etc., they import a lot of food from both Ukraine and Russia, and well, it's just part of the reason, wasn't, and it's the full reason, right? But like heavy food inflation is might lead to quite a lot of um, instability in those places, right? And also Europe, like a really bad scenario that could happen is if prices remain high, is that then also the US reinstates its export ban on oil, which they can do. You don't even need to go to Congress. It's like some rule, and Biden can just sign something in it, and then US oil companies aren't allowed to export oil anymore. What this would do is it would lower oil prices within the US, which will definitely be a good populist move because U.S. people drive a lot of if gas prices are too high, they're going to get pissed. So but that also then cuts off even more oil supply from the world, right? And then countries like China and Europe, basically all of Asia and Europe, are just heavy oil importers, right? And you remove Russia from the table, um, yeah, it's gonna be yeah, very interesting what's gonna happen, and not good.
Expect in the next 10 years a possible loss of potential growth up to a scale of 8 or 5%. A growth economy that we could have gained, but we haven't. And that by itself is
Oh
a
yeah,
tragedy. In theory, we will
yeah,
eventually
like
recover. When, as a civilization, we are not going to get lost. We are going to continue with our everyday lives. But this just makes all of the things way, way, way worse.
no, it can get really really bad. Also because like if energy prices remain this high or get even higher, um, and that would persist for years, which is possible, right? Like if we don't, if sort of Russian oil just gets removed from global production, etc., it is possible. Then you're going to get to a point where European industrial complex is just like going to disappear because its input costs are way too high. Um, because energy is a very large input, and if you just have to pay like 10 times as much for energy as your American competitors are paying, right? That's just that doesn't work. Um, but yeah, and that's energy, and then food as well, right? Food's also like, I mean, there were really massive fertilizer shortages in the world, um, you know, and just Ukraine and Russia being removed. Yeah, we think there's a if this persists, a pretty good chance that we get some severe unrest in Africa.
What bothers me is that, except that the rest of the world will eventually get divided, India has very strong interests with Russia, so they're not willing to be part of this embargo. Is all of the things we're discussing is known to the politicians, and they knew before the whole crisis began. Here comes the question: is like, how did we ended up here? I mean, they might, for things to become so public as they are at the moment, it means they really failed behind closed doors.
Mm,
Things didn't escalate as much in 2014. Yeah, they made some public statements so forth, but then they just forgot about it. Of course, in 2014, when they got Crimea, the Russians did have quite strong moral arguments to take Crimea. Anyway, let's not baffle much over this. It's already been an hour. Uh, Thank you, Lucas, for this discussion. The future is bleak. Uh, let's hope that this will come to resolution and that the war will end. Again, we do condemn the war. We're not supporting the war. It's complete disregard of international law. It's just, it's quite unfortunate what happened. Again, thank you, Lucas.